Hello and welcome to the Master Approach to Language, the English edition. How to sound more natural speaking English. Today's lesson will be about contractions, which is the joining of two words into one word. And specifically, we'll look at personal pronoun contractions, so I, you, he, she, we, they. And although this is something of a basic lesson, it is still one of the most important keys to sounding like a native speaker. I hear so many people who can speak English quite well, but they don't use contractions, and it's one of the most immediate giveaways that English is not someone's first language. And of course, that's absolutely fine, but if you're interested in sounding more like a native speaker, then we'll look at some of that in the video. And at the end of the video, we'll look at a few situations where contractions should maybe be avoided. Okay, in this first example, we can see that I am becomes I'm, you are becomes you're, and this one's interesting because although the correct pronunciation is you're, it's extremely common to hear you're, and that's especially true when people are talking quickly. For example, you're gonna come over later, right? You're gonna do that for me, right? And so, because this video is about sounding natural, it would be wrong for me not to include both the correct pronunciation, you're, and the much more common pronunciation, you're. Then we have he's, she's, it's, we're, and they're. Using what we just learned, how would you say, I am going there later? I'm going there later. How would you say, he is a happy person? He's a happy person. How would you say, we are not the ones who said that the party is cancelled? And I'll give you a hint, there are two contractions possible in this sentence. We're not the ones who said that the party's cancelled. So remember the contraction for it is becomes it's. And when a word, a noun, can be substituted for it, you can combine the word is with that noun. So for example, the party is becomes the parties. You are leaving tomorrow evening, right? You're leaving tomorrow evening, right? Remember how I said this one has two options? We could say, you're leaving tomorrow evening, right? Or, more common, is, you're leaving tomorrow evening, right? Now we'll look at the word will. So, I will becomes I'll, you'll, he'll, she'll, we'll, it'll, that one's kind of funny, it'll, and they'll. How would you say, I will come by your house sometime tomorrow. Do not worry, it will all be okay. Here's a hint, there are three contractions, and one of them is actually not a pronoun contraction. See if you can spot it. I'll come by your house sometime tomorrow. Don't worry, it'll all be okay. As you probably know, do and not combine into don't. Don't worry, it'll all be okay. How would you say, she will let you know when it is ready? She'll let you know when it's ready. In this sentence, there were two contractions. How would you say, we will give him a ride if he is still there? We'll give him a ride if he's still there. Now we'll look at contractions with the word have. I have becomes I've, you've, he's, she's, it's, we've, and they've. And so he's, she's, and it's you may also recognize as the contraction form of he is, she is, and it is. And so it's the same word, but context usually, well, almost always lets you know which word the contraction is referring to. So that's not much of a problem. And let's see some examples. I have seen that movie before, but I do not think that they have seen it. Here we've got 3 possibilities. I've seen that movie before, but I don't think that they've seen it. And now let's take a look at an exception to the rule. They have a dog, I have thick hair, he has 2 brothers. These would not be contracted. It would be completely wrong to say they've a dog. So what's important to know is that the word have is not contracted when it has to do with having something, possessing something, rather when it is about something that you've done before, something that has happened. Let's look at some examples of that. For example, you have never been to the zoo? I have gone every year since I was a little kid. They have lots of cool animals. Now pay attention to which ones should be contracted and which ones should not be. You've never been to the zoo? I've gone every year since I was a little kid. They have lots of cool animals.
I would or I had becomes I'd, you'd, he'd, she'd. And this one's interesting. You could either say it'd, but what's more common and what I'll explain later would simply be id. So it's almost like you skip the T entirely and just say id. Then we have we'd and they'd.
I thought he would do it. I thought he'd do it. I thought he'd do it. It would be cool if you came. An extremely common way to say this would be, it'd be cool if you came. It'd be cool if you came. As I mentioned before, it's almost as if you skip the T and go straight to the D. Id. And while this is not maybe the most proper English, it is extremely common, and so it's good at least to know. They had thought that he would leave by now. There's 2 here. They'd thought that he'd leave by now. And sometimes it's a stylistic choice when and when not to use a contraction. So for this sentence, it could be common to hear, they'd thought that he would leave by now, or he would have left by now. And so sometimes when the contractions are too close to each other, you can choose to leave one uncontracted. But this sentence is also perfectly fine. They'd thought that he'd leave by now. Let's look at some times when you should not use contractions. In certain formal situations, it can be better not to use contractions, or at least not too many, because they can come off slightly informal or carefree. And so if you're giving a speech, for example, it can be more effective sometimes to say both words instead of contracting them. Not always, but sometimes. In job interviews, another example of a formal situation, you may want to avoid using too many contractions at the risk of sounding unprofessional or too casual, but really this idea is becoming quite outdated, and contractions are so common, so accepted, that even in job interviews, most people would not even notice if you used them. Now, this is more of a stylistic choice. If you want to emphasize something, it can be better not to use contractions. So let's look at an example of this. I am not going to do that. Here, instead of saying I'm, we said I am to really emphasize the seriousness of the statement. I am not going to do that. Similarly, they will come to our party. So the person saying this is choosing to emphasize will by separating they'll into they will. And finally, she had thought that. Here we're emphasizing the fact that she had thought that, but something has clearly changed now. And so instead of saying she'd thought that, we've broken it up to emphasize the had more. Well done. So keep listening and practicing, because that really is the best way to sound like a native speaker and improve your English. Watch TV shows, listen to music, and pay attention to the way that native speakers talk and pronounce words. And check back on this channel for weekly tips on speaking English naturally. Thank you.